Captain Mike Tomer had fought fires in every corner of the city for 15 years, but he'd never faced an enemy that couldn't be defeated with water and courage, until the day protesters decided his emergency response was less important than their message. The morning sun cast long shadows across the apparatus bay of Station 19 as Mike walked through his daily inspection routine. The red brick firehouse sat in the heart of Metro City's downtown district, its gleaming chrome trucks and polished equipment reflecting decades of tradition and pride. At 42, Mike carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had seen everything the job could throw at him. Or so he thought. "Engines running smooth, Cap," called out Bobby Martinez from beneath the hood of Engine 19. The veteran engineer had been working on fire trucks longer than some of the crew had been alive, his weathered hands moving with practiced precision as he checked fluid levels and tested equipment. Bobby's thick, gray mustache twitched as he concentrated, a habit that had become as familiar to the crew as the sound of the alarm bells. Mike nodded, making notes on his clipboard as he moved to inspect the ladder truck. "Sarah, how's the inventory looking on the rescue equipment?" Firefighter Sarah Chun looked up from the compartment she'd been organizing, her black hair pulled back in a regulation ponytail. At 26, she was the newest member of the crew, but her thoroughness and attention to detail had quickly earned everyone's respect. "All accounted for, sir. Just finished rotating the SCBA bottles and checking the medical supplies with Tom." Paramedic Tom Jackson emerged from the ambulance, stethoscope draped around his neck like a badge of office. His easy smile and gentle manner had comforted countless patients over his 12-year career, but Mike had seen that same man work miracles under pressure when lives hung in the balance. "Everything's good to go, Cap. Just got word that the city's finally approved our request for updated cardiac monitors. Should have them installed next month." The routine was comforting, Mike reflected as he watched his crew prepare for another day of serving their community. These morning rituals had become second nature over the years, checking equipment, reviewing protocols, building the trust and teamwork that could mean the difference between life and death when the alarm sounded. Station 19 had one of the best response records in the city, something Mike took personal pride in maintaining. The atmosphere in the station had been different lately, though. For the past 3 weeks, Metro City had been experiencing ongoing protests over a controversial development project. The city council had approved the demolition of the historic Riverside Community Center to make way for a luxury condominium complex, sparking outrage from longtime residents who saw the center as the heart of their neighborhood. The protests had started small, but had grown increasingly organized and disruptive. Mike understood the community's frustration. The Riverside Center had served the neighborhood for over 60 years, providing everything from after-school programs for kids to senior citizen meals and job training services. It was one of the few remaining gathering places where families of all backgrounds came together. The proposed development would bring upscale housing that few current residents could afford, essentially pricing out the very people who had built the community. But as a firefighter, Mike's concerns were more immediate and practical. The protests have been interfering with city services, including emergency response. Just last week, Ladder 7 had been delayed getting to a medical emergency because protesters had blocked traffic on Main Street. The patient, an elderly woman having a stroke, had suffered permanent damage that might have been prevented with faster treatment. "You hear about the demonstration plan for today?" Bobby asked, wiping his hands on a shop rag as he closed the engine's hood. "My neighbor says they're expecting the biggest turnout yet." Mike frowned. "Where?" "City Hall area, but you know how these things spread. Last time they marched from City Hall all the way down to the waterfront. Tied up traffic for hours." Sarah looked concerned. "Think it'll affect our response times?" "Let's hope not," Mike replied, though he wasn't optimistic. The protests seemed to be growing more sophisticated, with organizers using social media to coordinate their movements in real time. What had started as peaceful demonstrations was becoming increasingly confrontational, with protesters viewing any city service, including emergency responders, as part of the system they were fighting against. Mike's radio crackled to life, interrupting his thoughts. "All units, be advised of ongoing demonstration activity in the downtown corridor." Exercise caution when responding to calls in affected areas. The irony wasn't lost on him. He lived in the very community where many of these protesters resided. His modest two-story house on Elm Street was just 6 blocks from the community center at the heart of the controversy. He'd driven past it countless times, seen the families coming and going, kids playing basketball in the outdoor court, elderly residents sitting on the front steps feeding pigeons. Mike's connection to community service ran deeper than his professional obligations. 3 years ago, his wife Linda had been killed in a car accident while driving home from her job as a social worker. She'd been working late, as usual, helping families navigate the bureaucracy of city services. The other driver had run a red light, and by the time emergency responders reached the scene, it was too late. That experience had shaped everything about how Mike approached his job. He knew intimately what it felt like to wait for help that arrived too late, to watch someone you love slip away while precious seconds ticked by. It was why he pushed his crew to maintain the fastest response times in the city, why he took equipment checks so seriously, why every call felt personal. His 15-year-old daughter Emma had taken her mother's death hard, and for months their house had felt hollow and silent. But gradually, through shared grief and mutual support, they'd rebuild their relationship around their shared understanding of how fragile life could be. Emma had inherited her mother's sense of justice and compassion, often volunteering at local charities and speaking passionately about social issues. Mike was proud of her activism, even when they disagreed on tactics. Emma had actually attended one of the early community center protests, and her perspective had given Mike insight into the demonstrators' motivations. They're not just protesting a building, Dad, she'd explained over dinner one night. They're fighting for their community's survival. When developers tear down places like the community center, they're destroying the social fabric that holds neighborhoods together. Mike understood that. What worried him was how the protests were increasingly viewing all city services, including emergency responders, as adversaries rather than community partners. The quiet morning routine was shattered by the distinctive sound of the alarm bells. The crew immediately snapped into action, years of training taking over as they dropped what they were doing and moved toward their assigned vehicles. Structure fire, 1247 Oak Street, Cross Street, Maple Avenue. The dispatcher's voice announced over the intercom. Multiple units responding. Mike slid behind the wheel of Engine 19 as his crew secured their equipment and climbed aboard. Bobby took his position as engineer, while Sarah and Tom checked their SCBA gear one final time. The address was familiar, a 3-story apartment building in one of the older neighborhoods, the kind of place where working families lived in small but well-maintained units. As they pulled out of the station, red lights flashing and sirens wailing, Mike felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with every call. After 15 years, the job still gave him purpose and satisfaction. Every response was a chance to make a difference, to be there when people needed help most. He had no way of knowing that this particular call would change everything, not just for him and his crew, but for the entire relationship between emergency services and the community they served. The morning that had started with routine equipment checks and familiar banter was about to become the first chapter in a conflict that would test everything Mike believed about duty, community, and the thin line between protecting people and protecting the system. Engine 19 rounded the corner onto Oak Street with sirens wailing. But what Mike saw ahead made his blood run cold. A line of protesters stretched across the entire width of the street, their arms linked together in a human chain that completely blocked access to the apartment building, where smoke was already visible from the third-floor windows. "What the hell?" Bobby muttered from the engineer's seat, slowing the massive fire truck as they approached the blockade. Mike grabbed his radio. "Dispatch, Engine 19. We have protesters blocking access to the scene at 1247 Oak Street. Requesting police assistance immediately." "Copy, Engine 19. Police units are en route, but they're dealing with multiple demonstration sites across the city. ETA unknown." The protesters had clearly been monitoring emergency radio frequencies. As Engine 19 came to a stop 50 yards from the building, several demonstrators turned toward them with smartphones raised, already live streaming the confrontation. Mike could see the determination in their faces, This wasn't a spontaneous roadblock, but a calculated tactical decision. Mike stepped down from the truck, his turnout gear making him an imposing figure as he approached the protest line. The apparent leader was a young woman in her late 20s with short auburn hair and intense green eyes. She wore a Save Our Community t-shirt and carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to confrontation. "I'm Captain Mike Tomer with Metro Fire Department," he said, keeping his voice calm but authoritative. "There's an active structure fire behind you. People could be trapped inside. I need you to clear this street immediately." The woman stepped forward, her chin raised defiantly. "I'm Amanda Sullivan, community organizer for the Riverside Coalition. And I'm sorry, but we can't allow emergency services to pass through this area." Mike felt his crew tense behind him. In 15 years of firefighting, he'd never encountered anything like this. "Ma'am, there are people's lives at stake here. Whatever your grievance is, this isn't the way to handle it." "Our grievance," Amanda replied, her voice carrying easily to the growing crowd of onlookers, "is that the city only cares about emergency response in neighborhoods they're planning to gentrify. Your department responds to calls here when it's convenient for the development plans. But where were you when Mrs. Rodriguez's apartment had no heat for 3 weeks last winter? Where were you when the community center's fire safety violations were ignored for months?" Sarah Chun stepped up beside Mike, her face flushed with frustration. "Are you insane? There's a building on fire right behind you. And there have been dozens of safety hazards in this neighborhood that the city has ignored for years," Amanda shot back. "But suddenly, when there's a fire in a building that's scheduled for demolition anyway, the fire department shows up with full fanfare." Mike's radio crackled with an update from Ladder 7, approaching from the east side. "Engine 19, we've got the same situation on Maple Avenue. Full street blockade. How do you want to proceed?" The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Mike could see the smoke growing thicker from the third-floor windows, and his thermal imaging camera was picking up heat signatures that suggested the fire was spreading. Every minute they delayed increased the risk exponentially. "Look," Mike said, stepping closer to Amanda while keeping his hands visible and non-threatening. "I understand you have legitimate concerns about how this community has been treated. But right now, at this moment, there could be families trapped in that building. Children, elderly residents. Are you really willing to let them suffer to make your point?" Amanda's resolve wavered for just a moment, but then her expression hardened again. "The city has been letting people in this neighborhood suffer for decades. Emergency services are part of that system. You come in, you make it look like the city cares, and then you leave while the real problems continue." Behind the protest line, Mike could see residents gathering on the sidewalks, some shouting for the protesters to move, others expressing support for the demonstration. The community was clearly divided, but time was running out. "Ma'am," Mike tried one more time, "I'm not asking you to abandon your cause. I'm asking you to let us do our job so that people don't die today. Whatever issues you have with the city, with development, with emergency services, we can discuss all of that after we make sure everyone is safe." Amanda looked back at her fellow protesters, many of whom were beginning to look uncomfortable as the smoke grew more visible. But her core supporters remained firm, and she felt the pressure of leadership weighing on her. "The emergency services in this city have been complicit in systematic displacement for years," she announced, her voice carrying to the smartphone cameras recording every word. "By responding selectively to emergencies, you enable the narrative that certain neighborhoods need to be cleaned up and redeveloped. We're drawing a line here." Mike's patience was exhausted. He turned to Bobby and spoke quietly but firmly. "Get on the radio. Tell dispatch we need the alternate route cleared, Pine Street to Maple, then circle back. Also, see if Engine 12 can approach from the alley behind the building." But the alternate routes would add 8 to 10 minutes to their response time, and Mike knew from experience that those minutes could mean the difference between a contained kitchen fire and a multi-story blaze that could spread to adjacent buildings. As if on cue, his radio crackled with urgent traffic from the incident commander who had arrived at the scene via the longer route. "All units, be advised we have confirmed occupants on the second and third floors. Elderly male on the second floor unable to evacuate due to mobility issues. unknown status of third-floor residents due to smoke conditions. The words hit the protest line like a physical blow. Several demonstrators immediately began to waver, looking between Amanda and the building where real people were now confirmed to be in danger. Amanda called out one of the older protesters, a Hispanic woman in her 50s. Maybe we should... No, Amanda cut her off. This is exactly the kind of emotional manipulation they use. They show up with sirens and lights and expect everyone to just get out of the way while they perpetuate the same systems that have been destroying our community. Mike stepped closer to the protest line, his voice carrying a new edge of urgency. Ma'am, I'm going to be very clear with you. Every minute you delay us increases the chance that someone dies in that building. And when that happens, their blood will be on your hands, not mine. The psychological pressure was immense. Amanda could feel her supporters wavering behind her, could see the doubt creeping into their faces as the reality of the situation became undeniable. But she also felt the weight of months of planning, of community organizing, of fighting against what she genuinely believed was an unjust system. If people die, she said, her voice trembling slightly but still defiant, it will be because the city has created a system where emergency services are used as tools of oppression. We're forcing this community to confront that reality. At that moment, a new voice cut through the tension. An elderly man had emerged from the crowd of onlookers, a resident of the neighborhood who had been watching the standoff with growing alarm. "For God's sake, let them through," he shouted. "My neighbor, Mrs. Chun, is in that building. She's 87 years old and can barely walk. Whatever point you're trying to make isn't worth her life." The human element suddenly made everything real in a way that political arguments couldn't. Mike saw several protesters beginning to unlock their arms, doubt and moral conflict written across their faces. But Amanda held firm, raising her voice over the growing murmur of dissent within her own ranks. "This is bigger than one building, bigger than one day. We're fighting for the soul of our community." Mike's radio crackled again with an update that made his heart sink. "Engine 19, be advised the fire has extended to the second floor. We need water on this building now." The 8-minute delay had allowed a manageable kitchen fire to become a structure-threatening blaze that was now directly endangering the elderly man they knew was trapped inside. Mike looked at Amanda Sullivan and saw not a villain, but a young woman whose good intentions had led her to a place where she was inadvertently contributing to the very suffering she claimed to oppose. The standoff continued, with lives hanging in the balance, and both sides convinced they were fighting for justice. The standoff at Oak Street finally ended when Amanda Sullivan's own supporters began breaking ranks. The sight of thick black smoke pouring from the second-floor windows, combined with confirmation that an elderly resident was trapped inside, proved too much for many protesters to bear. After nearly 10 agonizing minutes, enough demonstrators stepped aside to create a narrow passage for Engine 19. Mike and his crew rushed to make up for lost time, but the damage was already done. What had started as a contained kitchen fire had spread throughout the second floor and was threatening the third. When they finally reached Mrs. Chun, the 87-year-old woman was unconscious from smoke inhalation, her small body crumpled near her apartment door, where she had tried to escape. Tom Jackson worked frantically to stabilize her vital signs while Mike and Sarah battled the blaze that had grown exponentially during their delay. The woman survived, but she would spend 3 weeks in intensive care with severe lung damage that would leave her permanently dependent on oxygen therapy. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," Fire Chief Patricia Wells said during the debriefing that evening. She was a stern woman in her 50s who had worked her way up through the ranks over 25 years, earning respect through competence rather than politics. "How long did you say the delay was?" 9 minutes and 47 seconds, Mike replied, consulting his notes. In that time, the fire progressed from a single-room incident to a multi-room structure fire with confirmed life safety threats. Chief Wells rubbed her temples, clearly feeling the weight of the situation, and the protesters' stated reason for the blockade. Their leader, Amanda Sullivan, claims emergency services are complicit in gentrification efforts. She believes our response to calls in certain neighborhoods creates a false impression that the city cares about residents who are actually being targeted for displacement. That's quite a conspiracy theory, Chief Wells muttered. What's your assessment of the group's organization and intentions? Mike had been thinking about that question all day. They're not random troublemakers. This was planned and coordinated. They knew our response routes. They had lookouts monitoring radio traffic. They had media recording everything. Sullivan seems genuinely passionate about community issues, but she's not thinking through the consequences of her tactics. Over the following 2 weeks, the protest interference became a troubling pattern. Station 19 encountered blockades or delays on 6 different calls, ranging from minor inconveniences to dangerous impediments to emergency response. The first follow-up incident occurred 3 days after the Oak Street fire. Engine 19 responded to a medical emergency, a 58-year-old construction worker having chest pains at a job site. As they approached the scene, they found protesters had formed a human chain across the street, forcing the ambulance to take a longer route that added 4 precious minutes to the response time. Please, Tom Jackson had pleaded with the demonstrators as he carried his medical equipment on foot the final 2 blocks. This man could be having a heart attack. Every minute matters. The protesters allowed Tom through, but continued blocking the ambulance, insisting that emergency medical services were part of the same system that was displacing vulnerable community members. By the time Tom reached the patient, the man's condition had deteriorated significantly. What might have been a minor cardiac event treatable with quick intervention became a major heart attack requiring extensive surgery and resulting in permanent heart damage. The second incident was even more revealing about the protesters' evolving strategy. Station 19 responded to a reported gas leak in a residential area. Exactly the kind of call where delay could result in explosion and mass casualties. When they arrived, they found protesters had actually helped evacuate the immediate area and were directing traffic away from the hazard zone. But even as they assisted with public safety, the protest leaders took the opportunity to lecture Mike's crew about city priorities and systemic injustice. Amanda Sullivan used a bullhorn to address not just the firefighters, but the crowd of evacuated residents. Notice how quickly emergency services respond when there's a threat to infrastructure, she announced. But where's this level of urgency when families are facing eviction? Where's this coordination when children don't have adequate heating in winter? And carefully calculated. First, they would present irrefutable evidence of outside manipulation to Amanda Sullivan and other genuine community leaders, giving them a chance to separate their legitimate movement from the interests that were exploiting it. Second, they would coordinate with emergency responders across the city to document in real time the consequences of any emergency service disruption, using live streaming and social media to show the public exactly what happened when fire trucks and ambulances were blocked. Third, they would provide alternative channels for community voices that supported emergency services while still advocating for community development concerns. Reverend Washington's Moderate Coalition would hold counter-demonstrations emphasizing the need for both community protection and emergency response capabilities. Finally, if Amanda Sullivan and her supporters continued with the planned disruption despite being shown evidence of outside manipulation, Mike and his allies would implement what he called the transparency strategy, a coordinated demonstration that would force the entire city to confront the consequences of the current situation. This isn't about defeating the protesters, Mike explained to the group. It's about separating legitimate community concerns from the artificial conflict being generated by outside interests. We want to save lives and build bridges, not win a political battle. The plan was ambitious and risky, but everyone agreed that the alternative, allowing the planned disruption to proceed, was unacceptable. As the meeting ended, Mike felt a sense of clarity and purpose that he hadn't experienced since the crisis began. For weeks, he had been reacting to events rather than shaping them. Now, he was ready to take the initiative and create the kind of change that could benefit everyone involved. The question was whether Amanda Sullivan and her supporters would be willing to listen to evidence that challenged their assumptions about who their real allies and enemies were. Mike stood in his converted dining room command center at 5:30 a.m., surrounded by whiteboards covered with timeline charts, contact lists, and strategic objectives. Today was the day Operation Truth and Reconciliation would either succeed in exposing the manipulation behind the protest movement or fail spectacularly, potentially making the crisis even worse. His phone buzzed with a secure message from Captain Lisa Thompson in Portland. All units ready. Body cameras activated. Legal observers in position. Good luck. Similar messages were coming in from emergency responders across the country who had coordinated their own transparency demonstrations to support what was happening in Metro City. The plan had grown beyond Mike's initial conception into a multi-city effort to expose how emergency services were being systematically undermined by outside interests. The first phase of the operation had already begun. At midnight, Attorney Jennifer Reeves had delivered a comprehensive legal brief to the mayor's office, the city council, and the fire department administration. The brief documented systematic interference with emergency services, identified the sources of outside funding for disruptive protest tactics, and outlined the city's legal obligations to ensure emergency responders could perform their duties. The city administration can no longer claim ignorance, Jennifer had told Mike during their final strategy call the night before. We've given them all the evidence they need to distinguish between legitimate community concerns and artificially manufactured conflict. Phase 2 was now underway. Reverend Marcus Washington and his Martyr Coalition were holding community meetings throughout the Riverside neighborhood, sharing evidence of outside manipulation while reaffirming their commitment to both community protection and emergency response capabilities. Mike's phone rang with an update from Reverend Washington. We've got 43 families confirmed for the counter-demonstration this afternoon, the community leader reported. And Amanda Sullivan agreed to meet with us at 10 o'clock to review the evidence about outside funding. That meeting would be crucial. If Amanda could be shown proof that some of her most trusted advisors were actually working for competing development interests, she might be willing to call off the planned Emergency Services Accountability Week before it resulted in preventable deaths. Mike arrived at Mount Olive Baptist Church 30 minutes early, carrying a briefcase full of documentation that he hoped would open Amanda's eyes to how her movement had been manipulated. Reverend Washington was already there, setting up a conference room with printed reports, laptop computers, and a projector. How do you think she'll react? Mike asked as they prepared the materials. Honestly, I think she'll be devastated, Reverend Washington replied. Amanda's entire identity is built around being a grassroots community organizer who can't be bought or corrupted. Learning that she's been played by the same kind of corporate interests she's been fighting against, it's going to be hard for her to accept. Amanda arrived precisely on time, accompanied by 2 of her core supporters and looking skeptical but willing to listen. Mike had expected hostility, but instead he saw someone who appeared exhausted by weeks of escalating conflict and genuinely concerned about the direction things were heading. Reverend Washington said, "You have evidence of outside manipulation in our movement," Amanda said without preamble. "I'll listen, but I want to be clear that this better not be some attempt to discredit legitimate community organizing." Mike spread out corporate registration documents, financial records, and social media analysis on the conference table. "Amanda, we're not trying to discredit your work. We're trying to show you that some of the people advising you aren't who they claim to be." For the next hour, Mike walked Amanda through the connections between Community Voice Solutions, Urban Development Partners, and several of the individuals who had been pushing for the most extreme protest tactics. He showed her bank records demonstrating how outside funding had paid for equipment, legal fees, and social media campaigns that amplified anti-emergency services messaging. Amanda's face grew increasingly pale as the evidence mounted. "Marcus Chun told me he was a community organizer from Oakland who had experience with successful anti-gentrification campaigns," she said, staring at a document showing Chun was actually employed by a consulting firm that worked for Urban Development Partners. Sarah Kim claimed she was connecting us with other grassroots movements nationwide. She continued, her voice becoming strained. "But you're showing me that she's been coordinating with development interests that want our project to fail." The revelation that 2 of her most trusted advisors were actually working for competing developers hit Amanda like a physical blow. These were people who had shaped her strategy, encouraged the most confrontational tactics, and convinced her that blocking emergency services was a necessary form of resistance. "I feel like such an idiot," Amanda said, slumping in her chair. "They played me perfectly. They took everything I believed about fighting injustice and turned it into something that actually hurts the community I'm trying to protect." Mike felt sympathy for Amanda rather than vindication. She had been manipulated by sophisticated corporate interests that specialized in exploiting grassroots movements for their own purposes. "The important thing now is what we do next," Mike said. "Emergency Services Accountability Week is scheduled to start tomorrow. If those protests go forward as planned, people will die. And the only ones who will benefit are the developers who want to see this community tear itself apart." Amanda was quiet for several minutes, processing the magnitude of how thoroughly she had been deceived. Finally, she looked up at Mike and Reverend Washington. "What do you want me to do?" "Help us expose the truth," Mike replied. "Join us in showing the community that the real enemy isn't emergency services. It's the outside interests that have been manipulating all of us." The rest of the meeting focused on developing a coordinated response that would expose the manipulation while redirecting community organizing energy toward constructive goals. Amanda agreed to call off the planned disruption of emergency services and instead organize a demonstration that would target the actual corporate interests behind the community's problems. But even as they planned this reversal, Mike knew that some of Amanda's supporters wouldn't accept the change in direction. The outside agitators had been building momentum for weeks, and they wouldn't abandon their goals just because their manipulation had been exposed. Phase 3 of Operation Truth and Reconciliation would proceed regardless. A coordinated transparency demonstration that would show the public exactly what happened when emergency services were blocked or delayed. Mike had arranged for every emergency response in the city to be documented with body cameras, dashboard cameras, and live streaming. If protesters continued to interfere with emergency services despite being shown evidence of outside manipulation, the entire city would see the consequences in real time. "We're not trying to embarrass anyone or win a political battle," Mike explained to his network during their final coordination call. "We're trying to save lives by making the costs of emergency service interference impossible to ignore or rationalize away." The demonstration would begin at noon, with emergency responders across the city simply doing their jobs while documenting every delay, every obstacle, and every consequence of protest interference. Social media would carry live updates showing response times, patient conditions, and the human impact of blocked fire trucks and ambulances. Mike checked his watch, 11:45 a.m. In 15 minutes, Operation Truth and Reconciliation would reach its climax. Either they would succeed in exposing the truth and building bridges between emergency services and the community, or the crisis would escalate beyond anyone's ability to control. As he gathered his equipment and prepared to leave for the demonstration staging area, Mike reflected on how much had changed since that first block fire truck weeks ago. He was no longer just a fire captain trying to do his job. He had become a community leader fighting for both public safety and social justice. The question was whether the community was ready to see the truth about who had been manipulating them all along. At precisely noon, emergency responders across Metro City began implementing the most unprecedented demonstration in the history of public safety services. Instead of arguing with protesters or attempting to force their way through blockades, they would simply document everything in real time and let the community see exactly what emergency service interference looked like from the inside. Mike positioned himself at the coordination center they had established in the parking lot of St. Mary's Hospital, surrounded by laptops streaming live feeds from body cameras, dashboard cameras, and smartphone broadcasts from emergency responders throughout the city. Reverend Marcus Washington stood beside him, providing community perspective and moral authority to what they were calling the emergency response reality check. The first test came within minutes. Engine 12 responded to a house fire on the south side, only to encounter a blockade of protesters who had apparently not received Amanda Sullivan's message about calling off the disruption. Instead of the usual confrontation, Captain Rodriguez simply activated his body camera's live stream and began providing real-time commentary. "This is Captain Rodriguez with Engine 12, he said calmly into his radio, which was being broadcast live on social media. "We're responding to a structure fire at 1156 Pine Street, but we're currently blocked by protesters. The fire was reported at 12:03 p.m., and we've now been delayed for 4 minutes and 37 seconds. Behind him, smoke was clearly visible rising from a 2-story house 3 blocks away. As the delay continued, Captain Rodriguez provided educational commentary about what those minutes meant in terms of fire progression and life safety. At this point, the fire has likely spread from the room of origin to adjacent areas, he explained to his growing online audience. If there are occupants inside, they're now facing life-threatening conditions. Every additional minute of delay exponentially increases the danger. The protesters blocking Engine 12 were caught off guard by this approach. Instead of the usual heated argument, they found themselves facing a firefighter calmly explaining the consequences of their actions while thousands of people watched online. Some began to look uncomfortable as the reality of the situation became undeniable. Mike watched the stream from his coordination center, providing strategic commentary. "What you're seeing is exactly what happens every time emergency services are blocked," he said into his own camera. "These aren't abstract political issues. These are real people's lives hanging in the balance while we debate." The breakthrough moment came when a woman emerged from the crowd of protesters, tears streaming down her face. "My neighbor Mrs. Patterson is in that house," she called out. "She's 79 years old and has trouble walking. Please just let them through." The human element suddenly made everything real in a way that political arguments couldn't. Several protesters immediately began unlocking their arms and stepping aside, while others remained frozen in indecision. The division within the protest movement was playing out in real time for the entire city to see. Captain Rodriguez's live stream captured every moment of the internal conflict among the protesters. "We're now at 8 minutes and 12 seconds delayed," he continued his calm commentary. "The woman the neighbor mentioned is very likely overcome by smoke if she's still inside the structure." The protest line finally collapsed when one of the core organizers, someone Mike recognized as being connected to Urban Development Partners, tried to rally the group to maintain the blockade despite the obvious life safety threat. "This is exactly the kind of emotional manipulation they use," the organizer shouted. "They show up with sirens and lights and expect everyone to get out of the way." But the community protesters weren't buying it anymore. The neighbor who had spoken up about Mrs. Patterson physically confronted the outside agitator. "That's my neighbor in there. I don't care about your politics. I care about keeping people alive." Other community members joined her, creating a counter-movement within the protest that forced the remaining demonstrators aside. Captain Rodriguez and his crew finally reached the house after a 9-minute delay, but Mrs. Patterson had already been overcome by smoke and required extensive medical treatment. Similar scenes played out across the city as the transparency demonstration exposed the real-world consequences of emergency service interference. At every blockade, emergency responders provided calm, educational commentary about what the delays meant, while cameras captured the human drama of communities grappling with the consequences of their tactics. The most powerful moment came when Ambulance 7 was blocked while responding to a pediatric emergency, a 5-year-old boy having an asthma attack. Paramedic Lisa Chin activated her body camera and began explaining the child's condition to her online audience. "We're responding to a 5-year-old in respiratory distress," she said, her voice steady but urgent. "The child is having a severe asthma attack, and every minute we're delayed increases the risk of permanent brain damage from oxygen deprivation." The protesters blocking Ambulance 7 were visibly shaken by the gravity of the situation, but they were also being directed by one of the outside agitators who insisted that emergency services were using emotional manipulation to bypass legitimate protest. The standoff continued for several agonizing minutes, with the paramedic calmly explaining the child's deteriorating condition while protesters argued among themselves about whether to allow the ambulance through. The crisis was resolved when Reverend Washington himself arrived at the scene, having monitored the live streams and recognizing that this moment could define the entire conflict. He walked directly into the protest line and began physically moving demonstrators aside. "This is not what we're fighting for," he declared, his voice carrying the moral authority of decades of community leadership. "We're fighting for our children's future, not against their right to breathe." His intervention sparked a mass exodus from the protest line as community members followed his lead. But the outside agitators continued trying to maintain the blockade, creating a surreal scene where actual community members were fighting to clear the way for emergency services, while paid manipulators tried to prevent them. The live streams captured every moment of this community awakening, as residents began to distinguish between their legitimate concerns about development and the destructive tactics they had been encouraged to adopt by outside interests. By 3 p.m., the transparency demonstration had fundamentally shifted public opinion about the emergency service interference. Social media was flooded with comments from viewers who had watched the live streams and were horrified by the human cost of the delays. "I had no idea that 4 minutes could mean the difference between life and death," one viewer commented. "These firefighters aren't the enemy. They're trying to save lives while being blamed for political problems they didn't create." The demonstration also exposed the outside agitators in a way that no amount of documentation could have achieved. When community members began clearing paths for emergency vehicles while paid provocateurs tried to maintain blockades, the manipulation became visible to everyone. Amanda Sullivan, who had been monitoring the streams from her apartment, finally understood the full extent of how her movement had been co-opted. The people she had trusted most, the ones who had pushed hardest for the most extreme tactics, were the ones now fighting against community members who wanted to let ambulances reach sick children. As the day ended, Mike reviewed the results of Operation Truth and Reconciliation with mixed emotions. They had succeeded in exposing the manipulation and building community support for emergency services, but the human cost had been significant. Several people had been seriously injured due to delayed response times, and the trust between emergency responders and the community would take time to rebuild. The transparency demonstration had worked, but at a price that reminded everyone involved that political conflicts have real-world consequences that can't be undone. The pediatric asthma emergency created a moment of truth that stripped away all political pretense and forced everyone to confront the fundamental question: was blocking emergency services ever justified when a child's life hung in the balance? 5-year-old Marcus Williams had been playing in his backyard when the asthma attack began. His mother, Teresa, had called 911 immediately, knowing from experience that her son's attacks could escalate quickly from manageable breathing difficulties to life-threatening respiratory failure. Ambulance 7 had been only 3 blocks away when the call came in, but the route to the Williams house took them directly through the intersection where Amanda Sullivan's core supporters had maintained their blockade, despite her earlier agreement to call off the emergency service disruptions. Paramedic Lisa Chen's live stream captured every agonizing detail as the ambulance sat blocked while protesters debated whether to allow them through. "We have a pediatric patient in severe respiratory distress," she explained to her online audience, her professional calm barely masking her growing urgency. "The child's oxygen saturation is likely dropping every minute we're delayed." The protesters were visibly torn. Many had children of their own and could imagine the terror of watching their child struggle to breathe while help sat blocked just blocks away. But the outside agitators, the individuals Mike had identified as being connected to urban development partners, were pushing hard for the group to maintain their position. This is exactly the kind of emotional manipulation emergency services use to bypass legitimate community resistance, insisted Marcus Chun, one of the paid provocateurs who had been posing as a grassroots organizer. "They always claim there's some emergency that justifies ignoring our rights." But Teresa Williams wasn't a political abstraction. She was a real mother watching her son's lips turn blue while protesters debated the politics of letting help reach him. When she arrived at the protest line, carrying Marcus in her arms, the theoretical became viscerally real. "Please," she begged, her 5-year-old son wheezing and struggling in her arms. "He can't breathe. He's turning blue." I don't care about your politics. I just need help for my baby. The sight of a child in obvious distress, while protesters prevented medical care, created an image that no amount of political rhetoric could overcome. Several demonstrators immediately began unlocking their arms and stepping aside, but Marcus Chun and his allies physically tried to prevent them from breaking the line. "Don't let them manipulate you," he shouted. "This is how the system maintains control. They create crises and then blame us for the consequences." But Reverend Washington had been monitoring the live streams from his church, and when he saw the situation developing, he immediately drove to the scene. His arrival marked the definitive split between genuine community activists and outside agitators. "This is not what we're fighting for," Reverend Washington declared as he walked directly into the protest line and began physically moving demonstrators aside. "We're fighting for our children's future, not against their right to breathe." His words and actions galvanized the community members in the protest line. Parents and grandparents began following his lead, clearing a path for the ambulance while the outside agitators tried desperately to maintain their blockade. The live streams captured a surreal scene. Actual community residents fighting to let emergency services through while paid provocateurs tried to prevent them. The distinction between genuine grassroots organizing and artificial manipulation became crystal clear to the thousands of people watching online. Mike, monitoring the situation from his coordination center, seized this moment to address Amanda Sullivan directly through the live stream. He had learned that she was watching from her apartment, torn between her principles and the undeniable reality playing out on her phone screen. "Amanda," Mike said, looking directly into his camera while knowing she was watching, "you wanted to protect this community. So do I. But right now, we're both failing because we're fighting each other instead of working together to solve the real problems." The child's condition stabilized after the ambulance finally got through, but the incident had been broadcast across the city and beyond. Footage of protesters blocking medical care for a child created a public relations catastrophe for the protest movement. But Mike didn't want to exploit this advantage for revenge. Instead, he used the moment to propose something unprecedented: a public dialogue between emergency responders and community activists, mediated by Reverend Washington, to find solutions that addressed everyone's concerns without compromising public safety. The proposal came during an impromptu press conference Mike held in the hospital parking lot while young Marcus Williams was being treated inside. Reporters had flocked to the scene, expecting the usual confrontational statements, but Mike surprised them with a call for reconciliation. "What happened today shows that all of us, emergency responders, community activists, and city officials, have failed this community," Mike said. "We've been so busy fighting each other that we've lost sight of what we're all supposedly trying to protect: the safety and well-being of the people who live here." Mike acknowledged the legitimate grievances that had sparked the protests while also documenting the human cost of emergency service interference. The community has real concerns about development, displacement, and how city services have historically been used to support gentrification. But blocking ambulances isn't addressing those concerns. It's creating new victims. The live stream from the day's events had fundamentally shifted public opinion. Social media was flooded with comments from viewers who had watched emergency responders calmly documenting delays, while communities grappled with the consequences of their tactics. "I supported the protesters' goals, but I never realized people were actually being hurt by these blockades," wrote one viewer. "Watching that little boy struggle to breathe while people debated politics made me sick." More importantly, the transparency demonstration had exposed the outside manipulation in a way that formal documentation never could. When community members were shown fighting to clear paths for emergency vehicles while paid agitators tried to maintain blockades, the artificial nature of the conflict became undeniable. Amanda Sullivan, who had been watching the streams from her apartment, finally called Mike directly that evening. The conversation was awkward at first. They had been adversaries for so long that finding common ground felt strange. "I've been played," Amanda admitted, her voice heavy with exhaustion and disillusionment. "The people I trusted most, the ones who convinced me that blocking emergency services was necessary resistance, They've been working against everything I actually believe in. Mike felt sympathy rather than vindication. Amanda, you weren't the only one who got manipulated. These development companies are sophisticated operators who specialize in exploiting community grievances for their own purposes. The conversation continued for over an hour, with both Mike and Amanda sharing their perspectives on what had gone wrong and what might be possible moving forward. Despite their conflicts, they discovered they shared more common ground than either had realized. Both wanted to protect the community from displacement and gentrification. Both believed that emergency services should serve everyone equally regardless of income or race. Both were frustrated with city officials who seemed more concerned with political appearances than actually solving problems. The tragedy, Amanda reflected, is that we could have been working together all along if we hadn't been manipulated into seeing each other as enemies. Mike agreed to Amanda's request for a public dialogue, but he insisted that it be moderated by Reverend Washington and focused on finding practical solutions rather than relitigating past conflicts. We can't undo the harm that's been done, Mike said, but we can make sure it doesn't happen again. And maybe, if we're smart about this, we can build something better than what existed before. The call ended with both agreeing to meet the following day to plan what would become a citywide conversation about community safety, emergency services, and how to address development concerns without compromising public safety. For the first time in weeks, Mike felt hope that the crisis might lead to something constructive rather than just more conflict and division. The Metro City Community Center had never hosted anything quite like the public dialogue that took place on a crisp Saturday morning 3 days after the pediatric emergency that had changed everything. Nearly 400 residents packed into the main auditorium, with overflow crowds watching live streams in adjacent rooms and thousands more viewing online. Reverend Marcus Washington stood at the podium, surveying the diverse crowd that included firefighters still in uniform from night shifts, community activists who had been feuding for weeks, city council members who had been avoiding the controversy, and families whose lives had been directly affected by the emergency service disruptions. Today, we're not here to assign blame or relitigate past conflicts. Reverend Washington began, his voice carrying the moral authority that had made him a trusted mediator. We're here to build something better than what existed before this crisis began. Mike sat at a table on the left side of the stage, flanked by Fire Chief Patricia Wells, several crew members from Station 19, and representatives from other emergency services. On the right side, Amanda Sullivan was accompanied by genuine community organizers who had survived the purge of outside agitators from her movement. The format was deliberate and structured. Rather than allowing the event to become a political debate, Reverend Washington had insisted on a data-driven presentation of facts followed by structured dialogue about solutions. Mike began by presenting the comprehensive documentation his team had gathered over the past month. Using charts and graphs projected on large screens, he showed the real-world impact of emergency service delays on the community. The data is undeniable, Mike explained, his voice steady but passionate. Response delays have disproportionately harmed the very residents the protests claim to be defending. Low-income families have lost homes to preventable fire damage. Elderly residents have suffered medical complications due to delayed ambulance response. Children have been put at risk when emergency services couldn't reach them quickly. He clicked through slides showing specific incidents. Mrs. Chin's smoke inhalation injuries that could have been prevented, Maria Gonzalez's house fire that consumed her family's possessions during a 15-minute delay, the elderly man who died of a heart attack while protesters blocked his ambulance. Each of these numbers represents a real person, a real family, a real tragedy that didn't have to happen, Mike continued. Emergency responders don't choose who to help based on politics or development interests. We respond to everyone equally because that's what the community deserves. The audience was quiet as the human cost of the conflict became clear in ways that political rhetoric had obscured. Several people were visibly emotional as they recognized neighbors and family members in Mike's presentation. Amanda Sullivan's response was equally powerful, but focused on systemic issues that had made the protest tactics seem justified to many residents. She shared stories of families displaced by previous development projects, of promises broken by city officials, of a community that felt ignored and powerless. "We didn't wake up one morning and decide to block fire trucks," Amanda said, her voice trembling with genuine emotion. "We tried every conventional approach for years. We attended city council meetings where we were ignored. We filed petitions that disappeared into bureaucratic black holes. We organized peaceful protests that received no media attention." She explained how the community's relationship with emergency services had been shaped by decades of neglect followed by sudden attention that typically preceded displacement. When response times are poor for years, then suddenly improve right before development projects, people naturally become suspicious of motives, Amanda continued. "We weren't anti-safety. We were afraid that if we didn't resist now, in 5 years there wouldn't be a community left to protect." The dialogue revealed how both sides had been manipulated by outside interests that wanted to maximize conflict and chaos. Mike presented evidence of the shell companies and rival developers who had been funding some of the more extreme protest activities. Amanda acknowledged learning for the first time that some of her most trusted advisors had been working for competing development companies trying to derail the current project for their own benefit. "I feel sick about how thoroughly we were played," Amanda admitted. "People who convinced us that blocking ambulances was necessary resistance were actually working for developers who wanted to see this community tear itself apart." This revelation shifted the entire dynamic of the discussion. Instead of emergency responders versus community activists, the real conflict became the community versus outside manipulation. Mike and Amanda found themselves on the same side, working to protect community interests against exploitation. Teresa Williams, the mother of the 5-year-old who had suffered the asthma attack, stood up during the public comment period. Her voice was quiet, but carried clearly through the auditorium. "My son could have died because adults were playing politics with his life," she said. "I don't care about development projects or city politics. I care about knowing that when I call 911, help will come quickly. And I care about making sure this never happens to another family." Her words resonated throughout the room, cutting through political abstractions to focus on the fundamental issue: how to protect both community interests and emergency response capabilities. Elena Vasquez, the small business owner Mike had met during his research, also spoke about the need to balance community protection with practical safety concerns. "We can fight gentrification without stopping ambulances," she said simply. "Those aren't the same thing." As the morning progressed, a consensus began to emerge around a new framework that Reverend Washington had developed with input from both sides. The Community Emergency Response Partnership would give residents direct input into emergency service policies while ensuring that life-saving services could function effectively. The partnership would include rotating community liaisons who would work directly with emergency services to address concerns before they escalated into conflicts. There would be transparency in emergency response procedures, with regular public reporting on response times, outcomes, and community feedback. Most importantly, there would be regular community meetings to address concerns about development and city services, creating channels for legitimate grievances that didn't involve blocking emergency vehicles. Fire Chief Patricia Wells announced that the department would be implementing new community outreach programs, including regular neighborhood meetings and citizen academies that would help residents understand emergency response procedures while giving firefighters better insight into community concerns. Emergency services work best when we're partners with the community, not outsiders coming in during crises, Chief Wells explained. This partnership will help us build the trust and cooperation that makes everyone safer. The development project controversy was addressed through a separate working group that would include community representatives, city officials, and independent mediators. The goal was to find a compromise that preserved community assets while allowing for development that included meaningful, affordable housing guarantees and community benefit requirements. Amanda Sullivan's transformation from adversary to ally was perhaps the most striking aspect of the dialogue. She agreed to become a community liaison, working with emergency responders to improve communication and trust while continuing to advocate for community development concerns through appropriate channels. "I still believe in fighting for this community," Amanda said during her closing remarks. "But I've learned that real change comes from building bridges, not burning them. We can protect our neighborhood without putting our neighbors at risk." Mike's closing statement focused on the lessons learned from the crisis and the opportunities it had created. "None of us wanted this conflict, but we can't change what happened," he said. "What we can do is make sure that something good comes from all the pain and division we've experienced. We can build a model for how emergency services and communities can work together instead of against each other." As the dialogue concluded, there was a sense of cautious optimism in the room. The crisis that had seemed like it would permanently damage the relationship between emergency responders and the community had instead created an opportunity for unprecedented cooperation and understanding. The real work would begin on Monday, when a new partnership would start the difficult task of translating good intentions into practical changes that would benefit everyone involved. 6 months after the crisis, Metro City has become a model for community emergency services cooperation. The Community Emergency Response Partnership has not only resolved the conflict, but has actually improved emergency response effectiveness by building trust and cooperation between first responders and residents. Mike Station 19 now conducts regular community outreach programs, teaching fire safety and emergency preparedness while building relationships with residents. Amanda Sullivan leads a community volunteer program that assists emergency responders with non-emergency situations and helps coordinate resources during major incidents. The live streaming demonstration that exposed the consequences of emergency service interference has been studied by fire departments and community organizations across the country. Mike and Amanda now travel together to speak at conferences about conflict resolution and community emergency services partnerships. The chapter follows a typical day at Station 19, showing how the relationship between emergency responders and the community is transformed. When a fire crew responds to calls, they're greeted by residents who see them as partners rather than outsiders. Community volunteers help with traffic control and crowd management, making emergency response more efficient. Mike's personal life has also improved. His daughter Emma is proud of her father's role in healing the community conflict, and she started volunteering with the Emergency Preparedness Program. The stress and tension that had been building in their relationship has been replaced by a shared sense of purpose. The story concludes with a community celebration at the newly renovated community center. The event brings together emergency responders, community activists, city officials, and residents to celebrate not just the resolution of their conflict, but the creation of something better than what existed before. Mike and Amanda speak together at the celebration, sharing their story and the lessons they've learned. The key message is that real change comes not from defeating your opponents, but from finding ways to work together towards shared goals. As the celebration continues into the evening, Mike reflects on how the crisis that seemed like it would tear his community apart actually brought people together in ways that no one had imagined. Sometimes the greatest victories come not from winning fights, but from transforming conflicts into collaborations. The story ends with Mike and his crew responding to one final emergency call, a kitchen fire similar to the one that started the whole crisis. But this time, instead of facing blocked roads and angry protesters, they arrived to find community volunteers helping to evacuate residents and Reverend Washington coordinating with police to manage traffic flow. As Mike and his team work to extinguish the fire, surrounded by a community that now sees them as heroes and partners, he realizes that they've accomplished something more important than just fighting fires. They've helped build a stronger, more unified community where everyone works together to keep each other safe.